The alarm did not wake me slowly. It tore me out of sleep like a hand grabbing my throat. Red light spun across the walls of my quarters, and the voice of the station computer said the same words over and over. Intruders detected. All personnel take shelter. Intruders detected. I did not take shelter. I grabbed my jacket, my sidearm, and I ran. My name is Callum Ashford. I had been living on the trade outpost of Veril Station for almost 2 years, working as a hired guard for a small alien settlement that had no army of its own and no way to defend itself. The people here, the Ithran, were tall and thin, with soft gray skin and large dark eyes that always looked a little afraid, even on a calm day. They were traders and builders, not fighters. They had never needed to be fighters, not until raiders started circling this part of the sector like sharks, smelling blood in the water. I ran through the narrow metal corridors, past doors sliding open in panic, past Ithran families huddled together, past a mother pulling her child close and whispering words I did not understand but did not need to understand. Fear speaks the same language everywhere. Outside, in the open square where the market usually stood, 3 ships had already landed. Dust and smoke curled up from their engines. Men and women in dark armor moved through the square with weapons raised, shouting orders in a language rough and hard, nothing like the soft voices of the Ithran. Raiders, slavers most likely. They came for 2 things, valuable cargo and valuable people. Both were easy to find on a poor, unprotected outpost like this one. I ducked behind a stack of supply crates and tried to think. I was only one man. I had a pistol with 12 rounds and a knife on my belt. Against a raiding party of at least 20, armed with rifles and armor, I had almost no chance of stopping them. But stopping them was never really my job. My job was to protect the people who could not protect themselves, for as long as I possibly could, and to buy time until the distress signal reached anyone close enough to help. I peered around the crates and saw one of the raiders drag an old Ithran man across the ground by his collar. Another raider fired a shot into the air to keep the crowd moving toward the ships, herding them like animals into cages. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the terrible weight of knowing I could not save everyone. That is when I heard the crying. It came from a narrow gap between 2 buildings, quiet and broken, the kind of crying a child makes when they are trying very hard to be silent and failing. I moved toward the sound, staying low, staying in the shadows, until I found him. He could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old, if Ithran years worked anything like ours. His skin was a lighter gray than the adults, almost silver, and his eyes were huge and wet with tears. He was pressed into the gap between the walls, knees pulled to his chest, shaking so hard his whole small body trembled with it. I knelt down in front of him and held up my hands, slow and open, the way you would approach a frightened animal. "It is going to be all right," I said, even though I had no idea if that was true. "My name is Callum. I am here to help you." He did not understand my words, but he understood my tone, and after a moment his shaking slowed just slightly. I reached out my hand, and after what felt like a very long time, he took it. I am not sure what made me choose him. There were dozens of people in danger that day, and I could not save them all. But something in the way he looked at me, like I was the only solid thing left standing in a world that had suddenly turned to chaos, made the decision for me before I had even finished thinking it through. I pulled him gently to his feet and began moving him away from the square, toward the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the outpost. If I could get him underground, get him hidden, I could come back and try to help the others. We almost made it. A shout rang out behind us, sharp and close. I turned just in time to see 2 raiders standing at the mouth of the alley, weapons already raised, already pointed at us. There was no time to run. There was no time to hide. There was only time to move. I do not remember deciding to do it. My body simply acted before my mind caught up, the way it sometimes does when there is no other choice left to make. I turned and put myself between the boy and the raiders, wrapping my arms around him, pulling him against my chest, making myself as wide and as solid as I possibly could. The first shot hit my shoulder. The second hit my side. Pain exploded through me, sharp and hot, but somehow distant too, like it was happening to someone standing just a few feet away from my own body. I heard myself make a sound, something between a grunt and a shout, and I felt my knees buckle, but I did not let go of the boy. More shots followed. I lost count somewhere around 4 or maybe 5. My vision blurred at the edges, turning the world into streaks of gray and red. I could feel the boy shaking against my chest, feel his small hands gripping the front of my jacket, feel him crying my name, or trying to, in a language his throat was not built to shape around human syllables. I do not know how many bullets found me in the end. Later, the medics would count 8. 8 rounds, and by every rule of biology and chance, I should have been dead before I even hit the ground. But I did not go down. Not all the way. Not yet. There is something about the human body that people from other worlds never quite understand until they see it for themselves. We do not have the strongest bodies in the galaxy. We do not have the fastest reflexes, or the sharpest senses, or the thickest skin, but we have something else, something stubborn and strange, buried deep in our biology, and deeper still in our will. Our bodies are built with backups upon backups, and our minds are built to refuse the idea of stopping, even when stopping would be the reasonable thing to do. I stayed on my feet through sheer refusal. My legs did not want to hold me anymore, but I told them to hold me anyway, and somehow, impossibly, they listened. One of the raiders stepped closer, his weapon raised, confusion flickering across what I could see of his face through his helmet visor. I do not think he expected me to still be standing. I did not expect it either. I do not have a clear memory of everything that happened next. I remember shoving the boy behind a fallen crate, shielding him with what was left of my strength. I remember grabbing the barrel of the raider's weapon as he tried to aim it past me, forcing it upward, using the last of my momentum to knock him off balance. I remember the second raider hesitating, just for a second, just long enough, before the sound of engines roared overhead and the whole square lit up with new light. Reinforcements had arrived. A patrol ship from the nearest Allied station, drawn in by the distress signal I had triggered the moment the alarms first sounded, dropped down into the square with weapons of its own. The raiders, never fond of a fair fight, began pulling back toward their ships, dragging what captives and cargo they could grab in the chaos, but many were forced to flee empty-handed. I did not see most of that part. By then, my legs had finally stopped listening to me, and I went down onto the cold metal ground. The boy still curled beside the crate where I had pushed him, his small hand still wrapped tightly around my sleeve. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was his voice, thin and desperate, saying a word over and over that I did not understand but somehow felt anyway. Later I would learn it meant stay. Just stay. I woke up 3 days later in the medical bay of the Allied station, surrounded by machines I did not recognize, and the low hum of equipment working to keep my heart beating in a rhythm. It clearly did not want to hold on its own. A doctor, a tall Ithran woman with kind eyes and steady hands, stood over me checking a display that hovered in the air beside my bed. "You should not be alive," she said, her voice careful, almost disbelieving. 8 wounds, blood loss that should have taken you within minutes. And yet here you are, arguing with death itself. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw, and all that came out was a rough whisper. "Where is he?" I managed to ask. "The boy. Is he safe?" She studied me for a long moment before she answered, and something in her expression softened. "He has not left the corridor outside this room since we brought you in," she said. "He will not eat unless someone tells him you are still breathing. He will not sleep unless he can see this door." They let him in a few minutes later. He hesitated in the doorway, small and uncertain, like he was afraid I might disappear if he got too close. Then he crossed the room in a rush and climbed carefully onto the edge of my bed, careful of the tubes and wires, and pressed his forehead gently against my arm. I learned his name was Tovan, though the closest human sound to it was something like Toven, soft on the first part and firm on the second. I learned that his parents had been killed in an earlier raid, months before the one that brought us together, and that he had been living under the care of the outpost elders ever since, a quiet, watchful child who had already learned too young how quickly the ground beneath your feet could disappear. I stayed at the medical station for almost 3 weeks while my body slowly, stubbornly, put itself back together. Tovan visited every single day. At first he would simply sit beside my bed in silence, watching me the way you watch something you are afraid to trust completely, afraid that trusting it might make it vanish. But over time, the silence began to fill with small sounds, then small words, then whole sentences, as he picked up pieces of my language, and I picked up pieces of his. He told me about his parents, about the small garden his mother used to keep, about the songs his father used to hum while working. He told me about the fear that lived in his chest every single day since the raids began. A fear so constant he said he had almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that never stops. And he told me, quietly, one evening when the lights in the medical bay had dimmed for the night cycle, that he had never believed anyone would choose to stand between him and danger the way I had. "Why did you do it?" he asked me, his large dark eyes catching the low light. "You did not know me. You could have run. You could have saved yourself." I thought about that question for a long time before I answered, because I wanted to give him something true, not just something comforting. "I did not think about saving myself," I told him. "I only thought that you were a child, alone and afraid, and that no child should have to face something like that without someone standing beside them. That is all it was. It was not bravery. It was just refusing to let you be alone in that moment. He did not say anything for a while after that. He simply reached out and took my hand, the same way he had in the alley on that terrible day, and held it until he fell asleep in the chair beside my bed. Word of what happened in that square spread quickly across the outpost and then beyond it, carried by traders and travelers the way news always travels in small, connected communities. The story grew a little with each telling, as stories do, but the heart of it stayed the same. A human guard, alone and outnumbered, had taken 8 rounds meant for a child he barely knew, and had still found the strength to stand and fight until help arrived. The Ithran elders, cautious and formal people who rarely showed strong emotion in public, came to see me before I was cleared to leave the medical bay. They stood at the foot of my bed, a small group of gray-skinned figures with deep, ancient eyes, and one of them, an elder named Cyril who had lived through more raids than I could count, spoke first. "We have always been told that humans are useful because they are strong," Cyril said, choosing her words with slow, deliberate care. "We hired you for your strength, your weapons, your training. But strength was never what saved that child. Strength does not choose to stand in front of danger for someone it does not know. Strength does not choose to stay when running would be easier. Something else made that choice. We would like to understand what that something is." I did not have a perfect answer for her, not then and honestly not now. But I told her what I believed to be true. I told her that humans do not always feel brave in moments like that. We feel afraid, just as much as anyone else, maybe more, because we understand very clearly what we stand to lose. But somewhere underneath that fear, there is a stubbornness that refuses to walk away from someone who needs help, even when walking away would be the safer choice. It is not something we decide with logic. It is something older than logic, something that lives in the same part of us that makes a mother run toward danger to reach her child, or a stranger jump into cold water to pull someone out. It does not always make sense. It is simply there, waiting for the moment it is needed. Cyril listened to all of this in silence, and when I finished, she bowed her head slightly, a gesture I later learned was reserved for moments of deep respect among her people. "Then perhaps," she said, "we have misunderstood your kind for a very long time. Perhaps your strength was never the important part at all." When I was finally strong enough to leave the medical bay, Tovin refused to let me walk anywhere alone. He walked beside me through the corridors of the station, one small hand always finding its way back to mine, as if he needed to keep checking that I was still really there. The Ithran elders, after long discussion, offered me a new position on the outpost, no longer simply a hired guard, but something closer to a permanent guardian, both for the settlement and, specifically, for Tovin, who had no other family left to care for him. I said yes before they had even finished explaining the offer. The weeks that followed were quieter than the day of the raid, though never completely without worry, because the sector we lived in remained a dangerous place, full of shadows that could turn into raiders at any moment. But something had shifted, both in the outpost and in me. The Ithran no longer looked at humans with the same distant caution they once had. Children who used to hide behind their parents when I walked past now waved at me openly, some of them even trying out the few human words they had picked up, usually with mixed and amusing results. Tovin changed the most of all. The frightened, silent boy I had found shaking in an alley slowly became someone brighter, someone who laughed more easily, and asked endless questions about everything from the stars overhead to the scars now marking my shoulder and side. He liked to trace the lines of those scars sometimes, gently, almost like he was making sure they were real, making sure the danger that caused them had truly passed. "Does it still hurt?" he asked me one evening, as we sat together on a ledge overlooking the outpost, watching the twin moons of that system rise slowly over the horizon. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not as much as it used to. And every time it does hurt, I remember why it happened, and somehow that makes it easier to carry." He leaned against my side then, quiet for a long moment, before he spoke again, softer this time. "I am glad you did not run," he said. I looked down at him, at this small alien boy who had somehow become the most important part of my life on this strange, distant outpost so far from the world I was born on, and I felt something settle deep in my chest, something steady and certain in a way very few things in my life had ever felt before. "I am glad too," I told him, and I meant every word of it. 8 bullets should have ended my story that day in the square. By every reasonable measure, I should not have survived long enough to hear this boy's voice, should not have survived to watch him grow braver and brighter with each passing week, should not have survived to become something like family to a child who had lost everyone else that mattered to him. But survival, I have come to understand, is rarely only about the body. It is about what you are willing to hold on to, and what you are willing to stand in front of, no matter the cost. I did not become someone worth remembering on that outpost because I took 8 rounds and somehow kept breathing. I became someone worth remembering because, in the one moment that truly mattered, I chose to stay. And I have never once regretted that choice.